Hi, and welcome back to Abnormal Psychology. So we're now into part 2. And here we're going to review where we are right now in our views of abnormal behavior. Now, things have been moving more rapidly and are much more research-based than we've been in part 1. And as mentioned at the end of part 1 video, we are going to look first at the medical biological model, where the focus is on the role of genetics and the nervous system. And then we're going to explore the psychological perspectives and the theorists and their perspectives to understand the underpinning of abnormal behavior. And we will touch on the sociocultural perspectives and the interactional perspectives, where we'll see some coalescing of theories regarding a popular view to understand the emergence of abnormal behavior. So let's get started in part 2. Abnormal behavior may be viewed from various contemporary perspectives, and we're going to begin with the biological perspectives on abnormal behavior. There has been a big influence on biological perspectives with the advances in genetics, epigenetics, and stem cell research. Also, more emphasis on the role of the nervous system. There has been a stronger understanding of biological systems and the patterns of abnormal behavior, and in particular at the molecular level and cell communication level. Now we're going to start with genetics and how traits are passed from generation to generation. This genetic effect on how we look, behave, and function is called heredity, and it's a genetic process. All genetic material encoded in DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is known as the human genome. DNA is the molecular structure of the genome, is comprised of 4 organic compounds. Now I'm going to share this with you. It's ATCG. The A is the adenine, T is the thymine, C is the cytosine, and the G is the guanine. Now we have, I think there's about 2.8 billion base pairs and 20 to 25,000 genes. We've got tons of it in us. So it probably has an impact on abnormal behavior. With these numbers, it's not too surprising that genetic errors can and do occur. And this is when the numbers or the sequence of the DNA pairs are in some way wrong. This can lead to bodily structures and functions becoming abnormal or to fail. The epigenome is a molecular structure that overlays the genome and plays an important part in gene regulation. It does this with what's known as gene expression, that's turning on a gene, or gene silencing, which turns it off. The gene sequencing either is turning it on or turning off the translation into proteins that determine structures and functions of body cells. Epigenetics is providing insight to the origin and course of many psychological disorders. Stem cells, these are the cells that can divide and develop into a diverse variety of more specialized cells and can self-renew and create more stem cells. These are just little wonders. So many discoveries are being made and will continue to be made with the growth of the epigenetics and stem cells. So next, let's look at the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of nerve cells called neurons. They transmit or communicate each other through muscle movements, thoughts, writing, drawing, creativity, even in hallucinations, audio or visual. We'll start to break down the neuron. Now, every neuron has a cell body known as a soma. The soma contains the nucleus and carries out the metabolic or what's known as life-sustaining functions of the neuron. The dendrites, They project out from the cell body and are the primary receivers of signals from other neurons. The axon is the tail-like extensions of the neuron. It transmits signals to other neurons. At the end of the axon are known as axon terminals. Signals move from the axon terminal to the dendrites or the cell bodies of other neurons and to muscles, glands, and other parts of the body. Now, the swellings at the end are called knobs. They occupy the tips of the terminal. Each neuron has somas, dendrites, axon terminals, and knobs. Neurons communicate to each other by means of chemical substances called neurotransmitters. The basics of neurotransmitters, well, the synapse is the junction point between two neurons, one transmitting, the other receiving. Each neurotransmitter has a distinctive chemical structure and will fit only in one receptor site on a receiving neuron. It's kind of like puzzle pieces. Only one piece will fit into the lock. It's like a lock and key. Any malfunctions or any mistakes by the neurotransmitter in the brain can be linked to various mental health problems. Neurotransmitters are chemicals released into the synaptic cleft from one axon terminal to ascending neuron. There are a variety of neurotransmitters. So what are the functions of some of the major neurotransmitters? Well, there is acetylcholine. It's ACTH, the acronym, and it's involved in our learning, our movements, and memory. Reduced levels of this neurotransmitter is associated with Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine. This affects movement, attention, learning, reinforcement. Excessive levels of neurotransmitter dopamine appear to be involved in schizophrenia. Norepinephrine and epinephrine. They help regulate eating, metabolism, and alertness. Excessive and deficiencies of this neurotransmitter, of the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, have been connected with mood disorders and eating disorders. Glutamate is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, and it helps us stay awake. Serotonin, this is linked to anxiety disorders, mood disorders, sleep disorders, and eating disorders. And endorphins are natural painkillers that contribute to our sense of pleasure and well-being. Now, I hope clearly you can see the importance of neurotransmitters, that if you have too little or too much, it can certainly affect psychologically. Now let's look at the bigger picture of the nervous system and its parts. And there are two parts of the nervous system. There's the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and it looks after our bodily functions and our higher functions, our problem solving, perception, thinking. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, and this includes the nerves that transmit and or receive sensory messages from our sense organs and sends them to our brain and spinal cord, and that enables our muscles to move and recreate hormones. So we're going to review the central nervous system, and we'll take a little voyage through the brain. We're going to do a little overview here. I just want you to get the idea, should you not already know, that our brain is a complex organ and involves many unseen activities that enable us to live our lives. We sleep, we wake up, we think, we emote, we love, we understand complex math. So let's have a look. There is a hind brain. This is where the spinal cord meets the brain. The spinal cord descends from the brain and transmits messages between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. The brainstem, the pons, and the cerebellum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus, and the limbic system, and the cerebral hemispheres. This includes the frontal, parietal, the occipital, and temporal lobes. The brainstem contains 1. The medulla, which controls the heartbeat, breathing, blood pressure, coughing, and swallowing. Secondly, the pons. This transmits information about the body movements and is involved in functions related to attention, sleep, alertness, and respiration. 3. The reticular formation. It's also known as the reticular activating system, or the RAS, which plays a crucial role in arousal and attention. The cerebellum, this means little brain. The main function of the cerebellum are to execute smooth, skilled movements and to regulate muscle tone and posture. The thalamus acts as a relay station for virtually all information that flows in and out of the higher brain centers. The hypothalamus regulates hunger, thirst, sexual behavior, body temperature, our biological clock, the circadian rhythms, and a variety of emotional behaviors. As small as it is, the hypothalamus maintains nearly all bodily functions except blood pressure, heart rhythm, and breathing. Next, we can move into the forebrain. The forwardmost part of the brain contains the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the cerebrum. The thalamus is a relay station for sensory stimulation for virtually all information that flows into and out of the higher brain centers. The hypothalamus is vital for regulation of body temperature, concentration of fluids, storage of nutrients, and various aspects of motivation and emotion. It's also involved in hunger, thirst, and sexual behavior. It's the pleasure center of the brain, and we'll see this in we see this in rat experiments and things. It's partly, we won't go into it. The limbic system, it's made up of several functions, including the amygdala, the hippocampus, and parts of the hypothalamus. It's involved in memory, emotions, and the drives of hunger, sex, and aggression. The amygdala connected with aggression, fear response, and vigilance. The amygdala is part of the old part of the brain, which is why it's so basic. The hippocampus, this part of the brain is associated with long-term memory and our mental mapping, getting around the world in the way we don't get lost all the time. And the cerebrum is responsible for thinking and language. Surfaces of the cerebrum is the cerebral cortex. The corpus callosum, that's the bundle of some 200 million nerve fibers that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. The cerebral cortex, structurally the outer layer of the cerebrum, about 2 to 4 millimeters thick, involved in almost every bodily activity, including most sensations and most responses. Dividing into two hemispheres, each hemisphere contains 4 lobes. The frontal lobe, and it contains the motor cortex, which controls voluntary motor activities. The second thing it does, the Broca's area, which functions around our speech production, is in the same area. And the frontal association areas, which are involved in thinking, motivation, planning for the future, impulse control, and emotional response. The next lobe is the parietal lobe. Behind the central fissure, it contains the somatosensory cortex. This is where touch, pressure, temperature, and pain are registered, and other areas that are responsible for body awareness and spatial orientation. The third lobe is known as the temporal lobe, and it lies just below the lateral fissure and contains auditory area, your hearing, language production and hearing. The fourth lobe is the occipital lobe, and this lies behind the temporal lobe, and it contains the somatosensory cortex, where touch, pressure, and temperature and pain are registered, and other areas that are responsible for body awareness and spatial awareness, including vision. The peripheral nervous system, this is the second part of the nervous system. The body's peripheral devices And as mentioned just a second ago, the PNS connects to the CNS to all other parts of the body. The two main divisions of the peripheral nervous system are the somatic and automatic nervous systems. You'll see the graphic I've put to help give some organization to this. The somatic nervous system includes afferent and efferent neurons that transmit sights, sounds, smells, temperatures, body position, and all sorts of things. Purposeful body movements. The automatic nervous system is, as you might see, automatic. It regulates the glands and internal organs like muscles, heartbeat, respiration, digestion, dilation of your pupils. These aren't things we consciously do. These are done automatically, if you will, for us. The autonomic nervous system has two branches, the sympathetic division and parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division is active during processes are active during process that involves spending body energy and fight or flight. The parasympathetic division is active during the process of that replenishes reserves of energy. Okay, that was a bit of a handful of stuff, I'm sure. Not everyone here is all that into the biological components, but it's going to be repeated a lot in this particular course because there's an awful lot that is connected to psychological disorders. Now next we're going to go a quick review of the psychological perspectives, and we're going to start with the psychodynamic model. And this is based on Freud's work, and Freud developed the psychoanalysis as a means of uncovering the unconscious conflicts dating back to childhood that he believed were the root of all mental disorders. Freud found that he could treat these unconscious conflicts by tracing each symptom back to the root cause in childhood, often involved underlying sexual or aggressive instincts or drives and the management of these conflicts. Freud's work led him to what he labeled the structure of the mind. Now, you may have seen the iceberg model of Freud's structure of the mind, where first, and I think I've put it up behind me here, you have the unconscious, and the unconscious is the impulses and the repressed primitive urges. They lie under the water in this iceberg and beneath the surface. The preconscious are outside awareness but is accessible to us when we focus our attention. And then there's the conscious, our moment by moment awareness. Just as the tip of the iceberg is just a very small part of the whole iceberg, much of what we are aware of, wishes, impulses, fears, urges, and sources of our behavior, well, they're beneath our surface consciousness, hidden in the unconscious mind. Now, Freud also looked at psychic structures of personality. Now, these terms you also may have heard of before. We'll begin with the id. The id is perceived as a source of basal drive and impulses. Your hunger, thirst, sex, aggression, your basal drives, and completely in the unconscious. The id follows the pleasure principle, the instant gratification of instinct without consideration of the social norms or the concern for others are not even considered. The id operates by the primary process thinking. The id relates to the world in a fantasy and imagination. Therefore, the id can meet its needs through creating mental images, imagination and fantasy. The ego, now this is the conscious part of the mind, and it's our present awareness and attempts to manage the id's influence on with some good sense. Therefore, the id can get its needs met, but not risk the social disapproval. The ego is governed by the reality principle. That is, what is practical and possible of the id's impulses and urges to accomplish. The ego engages in secondary process thinking, the executive function between the id and the realities of the outside world. It aids in the development of a conscious sense of self. And then lastly, there's the superego, our moral selves. It's influence from parenting and internalized through identification. The superego operates under the moral principle as a strict adherence to a moral standard. The ego fights a continual battle to stay on top of the id and superego. Occasionally, there are conflicts that produce anxiety that threaten to overwhelm the ego. The anxiety is a signal that alerts the ego to martial defense mechanisms. Well, the unconscious protective processes that keep the primitive emotions associated with conflict in check so the ego can continue to coordinate reality functions. Now, sometimes they are adaptive, these defense mechanisms, and they're helpful. Sometimes they are maladaptive and unhelpful. See the list of defense mechanisms in your textbook. You'll see them listed there. Also under the psychological perspective is behaviorism. Behaviorism proposes that maladaptive behaviors are learned. Rather than emerging from some underlying cause, as with the biological and psychodynamic model, Ivan Pavlov, a Russian biologist, stumbled upon a form of learning that became known as classical conditioning. He did an experiment to determine dog salivation response to food. However, he inadvertently discovered that the conditioned reflex or the conditioned response. So let's go over the main conditions in the classical conditioning. First, we need to be aware that a stimulus is something that prompts a response. You need prior learning, like taking a test. The questions asked are like the prompt, and your specific learning helps to discriminate for the correct answer. The first term we'll look at after stimulus is what's known as the unconditioned response. It's given the short form UR. And this is the response that elicits by an unconditioned stimuli. An unconditioned stimuli is not trained and you have no previous learning. So without that previous learning, so that's unconditioned. You just learn it without getting it. So therefore, salivation to the presentation of food to Pavlov's dogs, or a startle to a loud sound, or the contraction of your pupils to light, an eye blink response are all unconditioned responses. You don't have to learn those responses. An unconditioned stimulus, or US, is a stimulus that elicits a specific, unconditioned, or instinctive response without learning. For example, food presented by Pavlov, he didn't teach the dogs to salivate, they did so without training. It's an instinct. A loud noise, a light in your eye, or a puff of air in your eye when you get your eyes tested, that stimuli generally produces an unconditioned response. Then there is what's known as a conditioned stimulus, CS. And this is when a previously neutral stimulus that eventually produces a particular conditioned response after being associated many times. Associated means paired. They've been presented together. And it's been paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So it's like the bell that produces the salivating. When the bell is included, when the food is provided, the dogs salivate. When the food is removed and the bell is rung, the dogs will salivate because they conditioned the response to the bell. The conditioned response is the learned response to the conditioned stimulus. That has occurred after the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired. Therefore, the conditioned response is the dog salivating just to the bell with no food. For example, if we were in the classroom together and I said the word psychology, now maybe for you, you don't know much about psychology, so that's kind of like a neutral stimulus. It doesn't produce anything for you. There's no conditioned response of what you're supposed to do when you hear the word psychology. But if I said the word psychology and then paired the word with a loud noise, I slam the textbook on the desk in front of me. Well, that's a conditioned stimulus. It may or may not, for some of you, create an association with the word. If I do it a couple of times, you'll all get used to it. But for some of you, psychology and the startle effect will be a conditioned response. That if I said psychology on a different day, some of you might have a startle response momentarily as a way of demonstrating that connection, that association. This can help explain, that process can help explain some phobias. John Watson, he initiated an experiment to prove fear could be classically conditioned. Now this was in 1919, and the video was labeled Little Albert. I'll post it in week 1 so you can see it yourself. Little Albert was conditioned to be afraid of white rats and other white objects. Once you watch the video, see why this is not to be considered an ethical research today. B.F. Skinner, well, he introduced operant conditioning. And it's a type of learning in which the consequence of a behavior can be manipulated in order to increase or decrease the frequency of that behavior being repeated and shaping an entirely new response. Therefore, he found that organisms learn new responses or skills when they lead to positive reinforcement. Now, for clarification, and this is important because it's misunderstood a lot, positive reinforcement is any pleasant or desirable consequence that increase the probability that that response will be repeated. Now, there are primary reinforcers. These are reinforcers that fulfill the basic physical need for survival and does not depend on learning. So your primary reinforcers typically are food, water, and sleep. Secondary reinforcers are acquired or learned through association, with other reinforcers. So for example, I get paid every 2 weeks. I had to learn the value of money. I didn't have a natural awareness of money. Praise, applause, these are all secondary reinforcers. Now here's the conflict that people get confused. Positive reinforcement are pleasant things that increase the behavior. Negative reinforcers are not likely as you expect. Negative reinforcement is not punishment. Rather, they increase the frequency of a behavior when they are removed. Okay, that might be confusing. So, for example, you have gone to bed, however, there's a dripping faucet that's just keeping you up. It's driving you crazy. You are using negative reinforcement by getting up and turning off the tap. Or if you take an aspirin to overcome a headache. Punishment is the adverse stimuli that decreases or suppresses the frequency of the preceding behavior when they are applied. So unfortunately, too many people misunderstand operant conditioning to effectively influence the learning of others. That includes teachers and parents. So there is a bit of a challenge with that because some of the terms seem to get a little bit muddy, but it can be very effective. So we're going to move into the humanistic perspective, and it's next. And it's led by both Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Humanistic perspective emphasizes that we all make conscious choices that provide some purpose and meaning to our lives. In the humanistic approach, we are born to achieve self-actualization. Now, there are clusters of traits that, when achieved, we strive for the next level, and it's known as the hierarchy of needs, and perhaps you've seen that. As they relate to abnormal behavior, Rogers believed that abnormal behavior had to do with people having distorted views of themselves. It was through the demonstration of unconditional positive regard, this is the belief that the behaviors that are in need of change is the behavior. It's, the person is valued in spite of the behavior. The pursuit of self-actualization is a path of self-discovery and self-acceptance, becoming our most authentic self. Now, if we continue still under the psychological perspective, the neo-humanistic model, it's by a Canadian out of York University, a Dr. Leslie Greenberg, and he's one of the originators of it's an emotional focus therapy. And as the root of Greenberg's approach is emotional intelligence. Now, essentially, that is about handling, the experience of emotions and the expression of emotions, and that our emotions are healthy, and we do so in a healthy manner and in coping with our life. We are healthier and happier with stronger emotional intelligence. Now, failing to do so, we risk our health, both physically and emotionally. Now, lastly, under the psychological perspective is cognitive behavioral perspective. The focus here are the thoughts, beliefs, expectations, and attitudes that are associated with or underlie abnormal behavior. Essentially, how our thinking can and does influence our emotional state and our actions. Robert Ellis used what is known as an ABC approach to explain root causes to people's troubles. A was representative of activating events, antecedents, things that lead to B, which is the beliefs that we have or the behaviors and that we use to evaluate things like events. And then C are the consequences, the emotions that we experience, the behaviors that we choose, and the thoughts that are a result of the antecedent, the belief, is the consequence. Now, Ellis focused on our irrational beliefs, and in doing so developed the REBT, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, which is an action-oriented psychotherapy that teaches individuals to identify, challenge, and replace their self-defeating thoughts and beliefs with more healthy thoughts that promote emotional well-being and goal achievement. Now, another researcher, Aaron Beck, he also looked at cognitive errors for underlying causes for abnormal behavior. He developed a model of therapy that became known as cognitive behavior therapy. And he proposed helping people identify their faulty ways of thinking. And he started with 4 cognitive errors that were later developed into 7. And we're only going to look at the 4 that are mentioned in your textbook for our purposes. The selective abstraction, overgeneralization, magnification, and the absolutist thinking. Now, these are faults in thinking. All right? Now, the next group will sort of move in. It's still under psychology. The social cognitive theory by Albert Bandura. Now, he theorized that learning by observing other people's behavior and the consequences of those behaviors through learning vicariously. I don't need to experience you touching the hot stove. If you touch the hot stove and you scream out and, flick your hands around because they've been hurt, I don't need to go and touch that hot stove to get the same results to know what you experience. I can watch you and learn vicariously. It often involves imitation, that is the imitation of maybe prosocial behavior as well as abnormal. Now, Bandura included a term called reciprocal determinism, and it describes how our behaviors both act on and are influenced by our own personal being, and the environmental factors that surround us. Major influencing factors are expectancies, our personal variables about how we expect or make predictions about whatever outcomes we think we can achieve. Cognitive therapists, as a reminder, focus on the role of distorted and self-defeating thinking in explaining abnormal behavior. Now, another Canadian, Donald Mickelbaum of the University of Waterloo, considers that the interdependence of thoughts, emotions, and actions. Now, when he says interdependence, he's meaning that they all interact with one another equally. So the thoughts, emotions, and actions, this interdependence, is what Michelbaum's cognitive behavior management was focused on, like other cognitive behavior therapies, on the cognitive distortions and errors in thinking. Now, our third group is the sociocultural perspective. The sociocultural theorists believe that abnormal behavior is rooted in social ills. Now, what that means when you talk about social ills is things like people who live in poverty, involved with societal stressors, and institutionalized prejudice and discrimination. So it's not just the individual. They believe that to eliminate abnormality, one must first correct the societal problems that caused it. Now, some sociocultural theorists argue that mental illness is a myth created to stigmatize people who don't conform to the prevailing social standards. Now, one of the alternative views is what's known as drift hypothesis. And drift hypothesis is concerning the relationship between mental illness and social class. And it's the argument that illness causes one to have a downward shift in social class. The circumstances of one social class do not cause the onset of a mental disorder, but rather it's the individual's deteriorating mental health occurs first, resulting in low social class attainment. Now, last but not least, because it seems to be a very popular one amongst researchers, it's known as the interactionist perspective. Now, no one theoretical perspective can account for the very complex forms of abnormal behaviors. Many theorists today adopt this interactionalist perspective. They believe we need to take into account the interaction of multiple factors representing the biological experiences that people have, the psychological, the sociocultural, and environmental domains in order to explain abnormal behavior. Now, the leading interactionalist model is a very popular one, and it seems to have a very powerful influence, and it's known as the diathesis stress model. Now, the diathesis threat model posits that some people have predispositions. Now, you can replace predispositions with diathesis. Diathesis is the predispositions that some people might have, genetic disorders that haven't materialized. So that's where the diathesis stress model. So that predisposition for a particular disorder, but whether that disorder actually develops depends on the type and severity of the stressors that they experience. So the diathesis is the predisposition, the stress which acts on it, which then could produce that disorder. Stress can be in the form of biological events like childhood inflictions, physical illnesses, or psychological factors like childhood abuses or family conflicts, or negative life events like long-term unemployment or death of a loved one. One other interactionalist model is known as the biopsychosocial system model. Now here, the three-domain system is integrated as a means of understanding cause and root understandings of abnormal behavior. As the name implies, there is a biological domain, a psychological domain, and a sociological and environmental domain to be explored. Now, that's a lot to accomplish in our first chapter, and I know this is a very quick review. Next week, we're going to look at exploring chapter 2, and we're going to review what is abnormal behavior and abnormal psychology and its history, and consider the historical and contemporary perspectives to the field of science. In chapter 2, we're going to explore assessments, classifications, and treatments of abnormal behavior, and we're going to consider how assessments are made, What classifications can be diagnosed using the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders? And we'll also consider the methods of treatment based on their major perspectives. Now, we will be repeating a lot of this in each of the categories that we'll look at throughout the semester. I hope you keep your e-text handy, as we will be reviewing the chapters in these videos. Highlight and make notes for yourself, as these are going to help you with your tests, because you will be able to use your textbook. I hope you're doing well. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you next week. Bye now.